Welcome to Lyve Talks, a podcast by Lyve, a tech and logistics company headquartered in Abu Dhabi. On Lyve Talks, we tackle fintech, logistics, business, and best practices in the workplace. I'm Karim the VP of Strategy at Lyve Global, and I will be your host. Welcome to a new episode of Lyve Talks. Today, we're going to be talking about scaling organizations. As you know, a lot of organizations go from very small to very big in a very short period of time. And that brings a lot of internal challenges to these organizations on multiple fronts. Joining me today is Omar Halabiye, Tech Director from Amazon Payment Services. If you want to maybe introduce yourself before we start.
Absolutely. Thanks. And thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. So as you mentioned, my name is Omar Halabiye. I'm currently Tech Director at Amazon Payment Services. I have over 20 years of experience in technology. I've been with Amazon for the last 8 years. And about 4 years ago, I relocated to Dubai to take on a role here in the region. Prior to that, I was based in the US. Very much looking forward to the episode today and sharing my experiences about scaling up tech organizations.
Great to have you on board. So maybe to start, just to give a very broad introduction, what are maybe the key areas any organizations that are scaling up should be looking at? I mean, we've identified 3 of them. If you can just talk briefly about each one of them before we kind of dig deeper into it.
So when I look at a tech organization and sort of assess its status and also its health, I look at it from 3 pillars. The first pillar is related to technology. After all, it's a technology organization. So looking at how is the current technology organization supporting the business needs of today, whether in terms of functionality that it's providing, but also in terms of non-functional requirements, things like stability, scalability, etc. And we assess both the current state in terms of how well it's serving the business needs of today, but also what's the forward-looking strategy for the technology to support the business as it tries to scale and move into either new products, new geographies, expansion of scale, etc. So that's kind of one pillar on the technology side. The second pillar is what I talk about as the process or the delivery pillar. And this is where we look at how effective, efficient, and how's the quality of the ability of the organization to deliver value to the end consumer. So how are we taking all the inputs and building great products and delivering those to consumers is kind of the second pillar. And the processes here relate to internal processes within the organization, but they also relate to external processes in terms of how do we engage with the ecosystem to get things done, whether it's partners, vendors, etc. And then the third pillar, arguably the most important one, is the people pillar in terms of understanding what talent we currently have in the organization, how well do they serve the needs of the business today, but also tomorrow. How are we developing our talent? How are we helping our talent scale, whether through existing resources that we have or ones that we need to hire for externally? And we'll dive deeper into each one of them. But those are the 3 pillars that at least I look at. And I'm always looking at it, again, from the current state perspective, but also how are we building the capabilities on a forward-looking basis to make sure that as the business scales, the organization capabilities are moving along and enabling that scale to happen.
So I think we can relate to this very easily. I mean, we at Lyve Global, we were a very small organization a few years ago and gone through the steps of scaling up, which has a lot of challenges. I think I agree with you that maybe the one overlooked sometimes, but the most difficult one is people. Because as you grow, a lot of pressure is put on people to sometimes change to something new without overlooking the technology, which is the backbone of it, and process, which is sometimes very nascent at the beginning and very informal, but then you start to process all this. Okay, maybe let's start with one of them. Probably I'll pick people first because it's the most important one. What are the challenges there? What are the things that an organization, even like us, should be careful about? And maybe based on your experience also, you've seen how these organizations are scaling up, what pressure it puts on the people.
Absolutely. I think definitely people is one of the hardest but most important challenges to address when it comes to scale up. I think two of the things that I'll highlight in people, I think one is what I'm going to call upskilling. And the reason I mention that is that as the organization's business scales, whether in terms of new products that we're trying to launch or geographies and the scale that it brings with it in terms of the support that's needed, you'll definitely notice that the complexity of the work also increases. So let's say, for example, you're a software engineer in the organization. You might have been building software that's needed to be used by, let's say, hundreds of people, but now the software is perhaps used by thousands or tens of thousands or millions of people. Obviously, that requires a very different level of engineering to support. Similarly, for example, if you're a program manager in the organization and previously projects were all being run across maybe one or two teams internally, maybe the teams are even co-located and whatnot, whereas now you may be dealing with dozens of teams internally, maybe split across countries, time zones, etc. Maybe even the programs involve outside parties that you're working with as well. That requires a very different level of skill set in terms of experience to be able to, let's say, manage stakeholders in that respect, handle escalations, etc. So you'll have to identify what are these, let's call them talent gaps that you have. Some of them you'll be able to bridge with the existing team members that you have through upskilling them and giving them that experience. But there are cases where either the talent is, let's say, non-existent, or maybe the talent gap is too broad or too wide to be able to be closed effectively internally. And that's where bringing in external talent who has that experience, who's been there, kind of done that, can help. That's on one aspect. The other aspect is what I call specialization. So typically when in a startup, we tend to index on generalists because they can do a lot of things with fewer people. But then again, as your business scales, you'll definitely need some specializations for areas where the complexity has grown significantly. So an example of that would be, let's say at the beginning, you may have, let's say, a software development engineer, and between a product manager and a software development engineer, they figure out, let's say, a basic user experience or a customer experience for a consumer-facing product. But as your product scales and you're figuring out, okay, well, how do we make the interaction more engaging to limit, for example, drop-offs, you're going to have to develop like a best-in-class UX, CX, and you may need to bring in like a specialist UX designer to help bridge that gap of the user experience. So some of that, you may have existing folks on your team specialize in one area versus another. In other areas, you may have to hire specialists. I think across both of these dimensions, and as you rightfully mentioned, you'll face a lot of challenges internally, because as you approach existing talent and convey the message of either upskilling or specialization, people may see this as a potential setback in terms of their career. So for example, they may be handling 3 or 4 things, and now because of specialization, you're asking them to focus on one thing. They may see that as a step back in their career relative to where they are. So how you deal with these situations is extremely both sensitive and critical in approaching it with a high level of empathy and really clarifying for folks, what does the path forward look like for me in this organization, and how is my performance going to be assessed? Because your performance moving forward may be assessed quite differently than it was before based on your responsibilities. Yeah.
I think I've seen it in the organization where as we grew out from one country to multiple countries, we've had to take certain people into side steps almost.
Yeah.
Where someone could be growing into a bigger role, but then suddenly got maybe side jobbed into something that may look smaller in title.
Sure.
But actually is bigger in potential.
Yeah.
And I think where we spent a lot of time explaining to these people is, yes, it might look on the title that you've been kind of downgraded if you want, but if you look ahead, that's actually the place where we have more potential, and that's how we grow. So the way we looked into it is explain more and more, like, what does it mean when you move into this new position? I'm not saying it's easy.
No, absolutely.
A lot of them actually leave.
Yeah.
When you do this, because it's also about what you were doing. It's about your position, right?
Absolutely.
So you feel like, no, that's not, I was bigger than this, I'm not for that,
Sure.
I will just move on. But that brings another question, like how do you make sure you retain then all these people? Because as you grow, you said you specialize, you might look as your sidesteps, you're part of a small organization, you're a big organization, you might not like it. Is there something that should be looked at to retain?
Sure. I think absolutely. I think definitely that's a challenge. I would say a few things that at least have helped in my experience in doing that. I think first and foremost, having people brought into the, let's say, the updated vision or strategy in terms of the expansion that you're doing and the opportunities that it's bringing. So buy into the vision has to be there at sort of an organizational level for individuals to be brought in. I think beyond that, I think taking it to the individual level to help them in detail understand how their new role fits into the bigger picture, how it will help them grow. So in addition to how is it helping the organization, explaining to them how it helps them grow, give them examples, for example, of other places either in the current organization or in other organizations in terms of how people were able to leverage these opportunities to grow. Because sometimes it's only when we see other examples that the concepts really hit home. But you also have to acknowledge that even if you do all of this, there will be people who find like, hey, this is no longer the spot for me. And part of it is just accepting that. I think our responsibility as leaders is to try to bring as many people with us as we can, but they also have to be excited about both the vision and their role in it. And so we try to bring as many people as we can with us, but we also have to acknowledge that for some folks, it may not be the thing that they want to pursue, and that's okay. We have to accept that as well. Yeah.
Of course. No, I totally agree. I mean, some people do accept it, and it's especially about the vision. You're absolutely right.
Sure.
It's, do you believe in what we want to achieve and where we're heading now?
Yeah.
That is the make or break, usually what happens.
Yeah.
Okay. I mean, it's a good kind of high level on people, which is very important. Maybe now if we kind of move on to process. I mean, in my experience, I can see that at Lyve, when I started, there was not many process that were in place to deal with different issues right and left that might be happening, especially on customer facing. And then as you start growing and going into more complex clients and complex things, you need to formalize more and more these process. But maybe I'm talking a lot about customer facing process, which I find as the most important, but there must be other things that are very critical. So maybe you can tell us also from experience on that topic.
Absolutely. I think as the organization scale, process really helps us ensure that we're doing things effectively, efficiently, in a repeatable manner, and we're maintaining a high quality bar, which I think oftentimes in the lack of essentially consistency may cause us to be suboptimal in terms of outcomes. Process side impacts all facets of what we do, and I'll give a few examples. So starting with people, since we were just on the topic, I think a few areas where process is immediately becomes visible and important are areas like, for example, hiring talent or developing talent, or, for example, onboarding new talent. So as a small, let's say, startup, your hiring process may be quite simple. You meet with the CEO or the founders or co-founders, you have a discussion, and then a hiring decision is made. As the organization scales, this becomes challenging even just from a scaling standpoint in terms of getting these things done. And that's where having like a formalized, let's say, interview or hiring process in terms of who's involved, how many rounds of interviews are there, what questions do we ask, etc., ensures, again, that we're able to move efficiently and effectively in this, but also uphold the common standard across the company and ensure that we're hiring people that meet the bar is one example. Another example that becomes very important, we talked about onboarding, because as you're trying to sort of inject so much new talent in the company, you have to get efficient at how do you ramp people up. Because maybe previously you used to get that person, maybe they spend 1 week with each person or each function to ramp up. But now you're hiring maybe 50 people in a week. You can't do that. It just doesn't scale. So how do you invest in things like documentation, whether it's wiki pages internally or video or training material that help you get people ready to do their work and become effective at what they do within the context of your company. So that's on the people side. Obviously, on the delivery side and on the technology side, you also need processes because, for example, previously you may have had, let's say, one engineering team building out all the products that you're launching. Now the team's expanded into multiple engineering teams. Perhaps they're even distributed across multiple locations or geographies. So how do you get the teams to work together? You need some, let's say, processes around code management, check-ins, how you deploy software, etc. How does the software engineering team interact with the product teams and how do they get requirements? So you do need to have some structure in place to help make sure everybody's working effectively together there. So again, it touches on so many different areas. A lot of this comes as the company kind of scales up, but it's important to set these as you move forward and ensure broad adoption so that you can make sure that everybody's working in a cohesive manner and delivering value. Yeah.
One question that comes to mind when we talk about process, and this is a discussion that I always have with some people when we say there's a process, please follow it, is agility.
Yeah.
People will, especially in startups, will push back saying, no, but if we follow the process, that removes the agility that we have. We need to be more kind of agile in way to speak. I'm not talking agile only in technology development.
Absolutely.
How do you respond to that, or how do you tackle these kind of discussions about process is too formal, like corporate?
Sure.
Agility is startups.
Sure. I think it's all about like a couple of things here. I think one is recognizing that I think any of the processes that we have, we need to be periodically reviewing them to make sure that for the amount that we're putting into them in terms of extra effort that it's creating on the teams, etc., that we still believe that the payoff of what they sort of, let's say, enforce still, makes them worthwhile. And while we may do that initially as part of launching these processes, I think where many organizations perhaps fail in that area is like continuously revisiting those assumptions to just make sure that the process as is still works. And I'm saying you may get to a point where you say, we don't need this process anymore at all, but maybe it can be tweaked is one area. I think the second one is really helping people understand why we have these processes in place and the importance of consistency, because ultimately as an organization, we also have to make sure that whether it's let's say one engineering team is working on a project or maybe another or whatever the case may be, that we're doing things consistently and we can't lean on good intentions for that because otherwise the outcome predictability becomes like if one person works on this, you get one kind of result. If another person works on it, you get a completely different result there. So those are things that have helped, but obviously it's something that we need to continuously inspect in terms of like how much process do we have and how is that impacting agility. I think that's the key to making sure this continues to work. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Maybe now going to technology, which is quite critical in scaling companies. Maybe I'll first give you to answer that very important question. Then I'll also give you a bit of my experience in the scaling up of technology. Yeah. So, how critical is it? I think there's a make or break moments usually in technology. Yeah.
So definitely super important. So I think when we look at technology, going back to what I had said earlier, I think the first thing is to figure out what state of technology is in supporting today's business needs and making sure that it's stable in that respect, meaning we're able to support today's business. I'm not saying in some ways completely hands off the wheel, but in some way like we're able to sustain what we have without spending a disproportionate amount of effort. Systems are stable, they're running, they're supporting business needs, which then we need to make sure that that's kind of the current state. But then we quickly need to make sure that we understand as tech leaders where the business is headed, what objectives does it have over the next, call it 3-year window in terms of new product launches, geography expansions, whatever the objectives may be, and make sure that we're starting to invest in projects and efforts that help make this a possibility for the business. Otherwise, what you'll find is you're trying to implement something on the business side, but your technology is 1 or 2 years behind and not able to support that whether not supported at all or maybe supported, but it takes way too long in order to do that. I think one particular aspect of technology scale-up that's maybe often overlooked but is super critical is simplification. So as you sort of start software, typically you can get something launched relatively quickly and be able to meet the business needs. The hardest challenge then becomes as you start piling up additional products into the mix, your technology footprint starts to get more complex. And what you'll notice in terms of symptoms are things like things take too long to get done. So you were able to launch features in weeks, now it's taking months. Another symptom is that you try to launch one thing, and then you end up breaking 3 or 4 other things as a side effect, or maybe you forget about some things. So those are all symptoms that, hey, we're not necessarily investing in simplifying what we have so that we can maintain that agility moving forward. So how do we make sure that we right-size the investment on simplifying what we have to make sure that it's ready to be bolted onto? And I think to your comment on make or break and why this becomes important is because of the fact that technology investments take time to both implement and then they have longer term implications. And so if a company waits too long to realize that, hey, the technology we have today isn't suitable, that's a very difficult spot to be in because it's going to take you maybe at least a year to get into that state. So you'll always be in that catch-up mode. So having a forward-looking strategy becomes super critical. Otherwise, you may fall behind and it may be very difficult to then catch up.
One thing, two things I've seen,
sure.
Right? And I'm not sure if you remember, some of the early tech things that were very popular. I'm the one that comes to mind, and not doing any promotion here, was WhatsApp.
Yeah.
I remember the early days of WhatsApp when it started. It was replacing other tools that were out there, and it used to fail every 2 days because of the massive success that it had.
Sure.
And when downtime for I remember there was like a downtime, and it says downtime 3 hours. It was normal, but people kept coming back to it because it was so popular. That's one extreme.
Yeah.
The other extreme is being too optimistic, which is, I think I'm going to scale too much.
Yeah.
I invest a lot in technology. I end up with the oversized technology stack, let's say.
Yeah.
And that makes it too costly on a lot of tech costs, cloud, database, a lot of things that comes with having such an So how do you balance between these two extremes? I know I picked two extremes, and any organizations can be anywhere in between. Yeah. And I can tell you that from our organizations, we faced a little bit this, a little bit of that, depending on the products.
Sure.
But I still see it till now where, we say, okay, we have all these clients coming on board, but that will need that much processing, that much database, that much SKUs. And they're like, oh, wait, tech can't handle it.
Sure.
But I said, but we've invested already. Yes, but we were, and then it takes you another 6 months, and it's too long. Is there, how do you balance between all these?
So I think two things, at least, that I can share that have helped me in the past. I think the first one is having a strategy, but then being very clear within the strategy, aligning on what you consider to be, I'm going to call them, for lack of a better word, like trigger points, right? That then give you the signal that, yes, we should embark on that next phase of the strategy. You can also call them check-in points, because you're absolutely right. You have a plan, but then you need to understand where are you on that trajectory. And tech cannot move independently of that. It has to be rooted in the business reality of how's the business trending based on its trajectory, and then at what points do we activate some of those plans along the way. So I think it's important to have that forward strategy, because without that, you don't even have a map to pursue. But then you should be very clear on how do you determine your velocity to move against that plan, basis some of the elements that you mentioned in terms of outcomes and adoption and things that you're seeing. I think that's one point. The other point is tied to that, which is how do you make sure that your stakeholders across your business are also involved in the decision making around how fast we're moving in the technology roadmap. Oftentimes what you'll see is technology organizations kind of do that in silo, which in my mind is in some ways a big mistake, because those two things have to work in tandem. And the only way you're going to be able to do that is that if all stakeholders see them as, in some sense, one. So how do you make sure that tech leaders in the organization also put on their overall business ownership hat? And then similarly, the business owners also think that, hey, there's no like business and technology. We have to look at it in that respect, because otherwise, you may have your business plans, but if the technology can't support it, you're not going to go far. So those are two things, at least, that have helped in terms of having the strategy, having the check-in points, and then engaging all business stakeholders to be part of the decision making. I think helps drive that alignment. But certainly, like a very sort of dynamic situation, and so there's no like right answer in that respect, but it's very situational to check in.
Because I mean, again, on that technology, because a lot of people struggle. I mean, one of the questions that any small organizations would face when they start facing bigger clients is, are you scalable?
Yeah.
Right? Because if you're not scalable, nobody wants to kind of risk their business on you, because at the end they are trusting you with whatever they want.
Yeah.
Specifically, if you're a B2B like us, we enable other businesses to kind of be tech enabled. We're not in the B2C, so we don't know. We're not dealing with customers, which is sometimes worse. Like I give an example. If your system is down, there's nothing there, then you're just losing revenue as you go along. But it's the same thing when you enable other businesses. They're losing revenue if your tech is failing.
Absolutely.
And I go back to the same thing is there seems to be a lot of times disconnect between the business and the technology, where even if they're together on the same table and they agree, sometimes tech is completely oversized.
Yeah.
And if they're oversized, is there a way to scale down back without hurting, or is there like some triggers that to go back again, or is it done deal? Like we've gone to that level, that's it.
No, I hear you. I think I think the scenario you mentioned in terms of it not being able to go back in a large way used to be true, prior, I would say, to cloud computing advances. I think especially now from an infrastructure standpoint, especially with advances in cloud computing, I think there's more sort of elasticity in that scale. It's not always the case that it's simple like, hey, flip a switch and you go from one to the other, because the architecture also needs to support it. But I think it's a lot more easier to achieve now than perhaps it was many years ago, where you used to even have to order infrastructure and used to take months or years to fully provision and whatnot. But it's still something that needs to be involved. And I feel like, especially in these conversations between business and tech, is like having the right talent that can help bridge even the communication across these two groups, I think becomes very important, because of the fact that in a lot of ways, like these two functions may be talking very different languages per se in terms of communication. So having senior engineers or tech leaders being able to explain the ramifications of some of the decisions that we're taking, I think really helps. I think bridge that gap as well. Yeah.
Good. Okay. Now that we've introduced the three of them, I think we've introduced people, process, technology.
Yeah.
Now, if you take the three together, how does this work now when you scale? Because it's a lot of moving parts.
Yeah.
Sometimes you're accelerating in one, but you fail in the other. You have no process. You're late in hiring. Then your technology is oversized. I mean, there's way too many things that are happening, and that can cause a lot of companies to fail.
Yeah.
Because they fail to scale, they fail in one of them. Some of them are critical, the other ones are not. Where do you think how does this plays out? Because I've seen different organizations do this differently. Is there kind of a playbook or kind of a way to handle all this?
Sure. So I think in some sense, as you look at your three pillars, I think for me, what I do is like become intentional about evaluating each one of them in terms of where are we today and what are the gaps that we see and how are we closing them, just from a current state standpoint, to make sure that we have, like, for what we have today, we're able to sustainably meet. At the same time, each of these pillars, we need to develop like a longer term strategy for that, which has like, hey, what are the priorities for the next, let's call it 6 to 12 months, 12 to 18 months, or 24 months, and then 24 months and beyond. And then figure out that how are we advancing in each one of them. And to the point earlier about the trigger points or the check-in points that we have along the way. And you're absolutely right in that you may be further ahead in one area versus another, just basis on the need and basis on the experience that we have. But I think being intentional to be looking at these things proactively rather than reactively, I think is very important. And that's where most of us, in terms of like, you see organizations sometimes go on one side where it's like no forward-looking planning and just kind of playing it by ear as things materialize, which is quite dangerous if you end up scaling significantly in a very short period of time. But you can also go to the other extreme where like too much forward planning and too much rigor right up from the outset could impact both agility and sustainability in the short, medium term as well. Yeah.
One other thing that might happen in startups, which is quite common, is pivoting.
Yeah.
So pivoting is, for the listener, is when an organization is going in one direction, they have a product, seems to work, but not good enough to scale, or it doesn't have good traction. Yeah. They pivot to something else. Could be close, could be very far. It all depends on what the organization is trying to do. How does this impact what we talked about? Because pivoting sometimes is quite drastic.
Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. It has a huge impact. I think once, like, let's say we're considering a pivot, I think that obviously drives a change in the business strategy, right? In terms of even what customers you're serving, or what your revenue model is, or any of those aspects. I think then we need to go back and look at the technology strategy that we have at different times, depending on how drastic the pivot is. You may need to, in some ways, start from scratch, or you may be able to leverage some of the pieces that you have. But I think it's important to reassess your tech strategy, whether it's an update or a complete revision, and then figure out that, yes, out of the things that you've already invested in and built, what can be leveraged to support the new business strategy, or perhaps what needs to be redone. But I think following the same mechanism, I think, helps you get there. It's just a matter of figuring out, again, you're not necessarily this time starting from complete scratch, but how much of what you have is usable or not is something you'll have to determine in conjunction with your business strategy.
Another one also, and I'm kind of asking different questions, but they're like acquisitions.
Yeah.
So ourselves, we've done a few acquisitions, and what I've seen is it's a lot of challenges in those three, right? Yeah. Because it's also depending on the type of acquisition you're doing. Is it like a complete merger, or is it just you're leaving them independent, but still trying to standardize certain things in the back? You might be standardizing some process. You might want to push the same technology on both. Yeah. And that also puts more pressure in kind of how you scale, because a lot of organizations, they get to a point where organic is not scaling. They start acquiring either similar companies or very different technologies. How is that also impacting how you take this forward in scaling?
No, definitely. I think definitely. It impacts all the areas we talked about, but maybe I'll focus on the technology pillar for now. I think on the technology pillar, similarly, like you go back to your technology strategy and you want to take a look at it again in terms of, for example, let's say the ordering systems technology footprint that we have. How convicted are we that, let's say, the current solution that you have within the, let's call it the mother organization that you're part of, that you have, will meet and support the needs of customers over the next 3 years? And you may take a decision that, hey, this will become, let's say, our golden technology for ordering moving forward, in which case, you know that even if you go and acquire another company and they have an ordering solution, eventually you want to get to a point where you merge that into what you have. Now, of course, then you have to figure out that, hey, in between the time you acquire till you get to that point, going back to the discussion on trigger points, is like, what trigger points do we actually use to tell us how quickly we should move in that direction? And you may say like, hey, this becomes something we work on like literally day one post the acquisition, versus saying like, we will let it run through, and maybe, for example, all new onboardings go to the new ordering system, in which case we let the older system kind of degenerate over time and kind of sort of go by passing with time. So those are the things you would look at. But at any point in time, you should have a clear technology strategy across your teams that really helps them understand, like, what's the future of the technology that we have and what are we working towards. Even if in between you may have a lot of these hybrid, messy states in between that you need to manage, but you need to be clear on where you want to get to eventually. Yeah.
Okay, maybe to summarize all what we've discussed, can you please recap for any of the listener what are the key things they should be very careful about, so not to fail when they scale up? Like just the key points, the key takeaways.
Yeah, so I think on the people side of things, I think making sure that as we talked about, like you're respecting the talent that you have and what they've achieved to date, because you wouldn't be in a state of considering scaling up if what you've done so far isn't successful. So you want to recognize the team that you have, but you also want to make sure they understand that for us to tackle the next wave of growth, we have to change. We have to change the way we do things in terms of process. We may have to change the technology that we have to help the business scale. But I think, recognizing that, bringing them on board, but also being clear that things need to evolve, I think is critical, because you want to make sure that ultimately you bring the organization along. Otherwise, you're going to go halfway there and then figure out that, hey, you don't have the team with you that's needed to help you be successful. I think to me is probably one of the core messages. I think the other core message is just being intentional about forward planning, because you cannot decide that in any one day that you want to scale up and you can just go. So being intentional about planning, thinking about, like, on the people side, what talent do we have today? What talent do we need tomorrow? What's the gap and how do we bridge it? Similarly, from a process standpoint, what's working well today? What's not working well? And where are we seeing inefficiencies or ineffectiveness and outcomes that come through? And how do we put in the right processes in place? And then similarly on technology, how are we investing today to make sure that as our business, scales and product numbers or geographies or whatever else, that we're able to support it. So I think those are, to me, probably the two key takeaways that I would put in place. Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you, Omar, for being our guest today.
No worries. Yeah, most welcome.
And that's it for today from Lyve Talks. You can find us on YouTube or anywhere you get your podcasts. Thank you, and see you next time.